recording. I recording? The heck? Oh, wait. What does it say if I'm recording or not? It doesn't have how long I've been recording for. I guess they took that out. Boo. Why'd they take that out? Fucking, that's so fucking weird. Huh. Let's see what that is about. But yeah, it's weird. Like, I can't see, like, the seconds I've been recording. Oh, that's weird. I don't like that. Okay, but yes, welcome, everyone. Welcome to another... We're almost done with... Well, I say almost. There are 35 chapters in this book. We are on chapter 8. Chapter 8. So, chapter 28, sorry. So, last we left off, I guess I can figure out, like, the settings of, like, where I can figure it out later. Alright. But yeah, last time we left off, Hatsumomo's no longer in the Okia or in Sayuri/Chiyo's life anymore. So, yeah. I don't remember the other things that happened, except for that was the main thing that happened. Okay, well, let's get a move on. Okay. So, chapter 28. Yeah, chapter 28. In Japan, we refer to the years from the Depression through World War II as Kuraitani, the Valley of Darkness, when so many people lived like children whose heads had slipped beneath the waves. As is often the case, those of us in Gion didn't suffer quite as badly as others. While most Japanese lived in the dark valley all through the 1930s, for example, in Gion we were still warmed by a bit of sun. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you why. Women who are mistresses of cabinet ministers and naval commanders are the recipients of enormous good fortune, and they pass that good fortune along to others. You might say Gion was like a pond high up on a mountaintop, fed by streams of rich spring water. More water poured in at some spots than others, but it raised the pond as a whole. Because of General Totori, our Okia was one of the spots. Oh yeah, and I get General Totori is her Danna now. That's it. Yeah, because of General Totori, our Okia was one of the spots where the rich spring water came pouring in. Things grew worse and worse around us during the course of several years, and yet long after the rationing of goods had begun, we continued to receive regular supplies of foodstuffs, tea, linens, and even some luxuries like cosmetics and chocolate. We might have kept these things to ourselves and lived behind closed doors, but Gion isn't that sort of place. Mother passed much of it along and considered it well spent, not because she was a generous woman, of course, but because we were all like spiders, crowded together on the same web. From time to time, people came asking for help, and we were pleased to give it when we could. At some point in the fall of 1941, for example, the military police found a maid with a box containing probably 10 times more ration coupons than her Okia was supposed to have. Her mistress sent her. Her mistress sent her to us for safekeeping until arrangements could be made to take her to the countryside. Because of course, every okia in Gyeong hoarded coupons. The better the okia, the more it usually had. The maid had sent. The maid sent to us. Yeah, the maid was sent to us rather than to someone else, because General Totori had instructed the military police to leave us alone. So you see, even within that mountaintop pond, even within that mountaintop pond that was Gyeong, we were the fish swimming in the very warmest water of all. As the darkness continued to settle over Japan, there did finally come a time when even the pinpoint of light in which we'd managed to keep ourselves suddenly went out. It happened at a single moment, early one afternoon just a few weeks before New Year's Day in December 1942. I was eating my breakfast, or at least my first meal of the day, for I had been busy helping to clean the okia in preparation of the new year, when a man's voice called out at our entrance. I thought he was probably just making a delivery, so I went on with my meal, but a moment later, the maid interrupted me to say a military policeman had come looking for Mother. A military policeman? I said. Tell him Mother is out. Yes, I did, ma'am. He'd like to speak with you instead. When I reached the front hall, I found the policeman removing his boots at the entryway. Probably most people would have felt relieved just to note that his pistol was still snapped inside its leather case. But as I say, our Okia had lived differently right up until that moment. Ordinarily, a policeman would have been more apologetic even than most visitors, since his presence would alarm us. But to see him tugging at his boots, well, this was his way of saying he planned to come in whether we invited him or not. I bowed and greeted him, but he did nothing more than glance at me as though he would deal with me later. Finally, he pulled up his socks and pulled down his cap and stepped up into the front entrance hall and said he wanted to see our vegetable garden. Just like that, with no word of apology for troubling us. You see, by this time, nearly everyone in Kyoto and probably the rest of the country had converted their decorative gardens into vegetable gardens. Everyone but people like us, that is. General Totori provided us with enough food that we didn't need to plow up our garden, and were instead able to go on enjoying the hair moss and spear flowers and the tiny maple in the corner. Since it was winter, I hoped the policeman would look only at the spots of frozen ground where the vegetation had died back, and imagine that we'd planted squash and sweet potatoes amid the decorative plants. Hold on. I'm cooking something. I'll be right back. My brownie smells fucking delicious. I can't wait to have some later. I mean, I already have a cookie that I brought from, well, who knows? Alright. So, yeah. Yeah, since it was winter, I'd hoped... Oh. Am I a little muffled? Am I so muffled? I don't know what I did. Maybe I did something? Yeah, if I sound muffled, tell me. Huh. I don't know why it's sounding muffled. Is it still sounding muffled? Yeah, why don't you try reconnecting? Maybe that'll work. Alright, can you hear me better? Can you hear me better? Because if not, I don't know what to tell you. It's not on my end. I don't know what I did wrong. Okay, I mean, if it's just a little muffled, but you can still, like, make out what I'm saying, should be fine. That's weird. Hold on. Okay. I reconnected. Let's see if that works. Ah, I don't know either. I didn't do anything funky to my thing. Hopefully it doesn't come out muffled in OBS too. If I do, I apologize. Yeah, hopefully not. I don't think so, but maybe? Hopefully it's not a problem in OBS. I can't really tell if it's a problem. But yeah, let's continue. Oh, fuck. I lost my page. Hold on. Okay. I just tried fucking... I don't know. Trying to do something with the, I tried to shake my computer, see if that would help. But yeah, I guess let's keep going on with it. Okay. Yeah. Since it was winter, I hope the policeman would look only at the spots of frozen ground where the vegetation had died back, and imagine that we planted squash and sweet potatoes amid the decorative plants. So after I'd led him down into the courtyard, I didn't say a word. I just watched as he knelt down and touched the dirt with his fingers. I suppose he wanted to feel whether or not the ground had been dug up for planting. I was so I was so desperate. Uh, I was so desperate for something to. Yeah, I was so desperate for something to say that I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Doesn't the dusting of snow on the ground make you think of foam on the ocean? He didn't answer me, but just stood up to his full height and asked what vegetables we had planted. Officer, I said, I'm terribly sorry, but the truth is we haven't had an opportunity to plant any vegetables at all. And now that the ground is so hard and cold, your neighborhood association was quite right about you, he said, taking off his cap. He brought out from his pocket a slip of paper and began to read a long list of misdeeds our Okia had committed. I don't even remember them all. Hoarding cotton materials, failing to turn in metal and rubber goods needed for the war effort, improper use of ration tickets, all sorts of things like that. It's true that we had done these things, just as every other Okia and Gion had. Our crime, I suppose, was that we'd enjoyed more good fortune than most, and had survived longer and in better shape than all but a fair few. Luckily for me, Mother returned just then. She didn't seem at all surprised to find a military policeman there, and in fact, she behaved more politely toward him than I'd ever seen her behave toward anyone. She led him into our reception room and served him some of our ill-gotten tea. The door was closed, but I could hear them talking for a long while. At one point, when she came out to fetch something, she pulled me aside and told me this. General Totori was taken into custody this morning. You'd better hurry and hide our best things, or they'll be gone tomorrow. Back in Yoroido, I used to swim on chilly spring days, and afterward lie on the rocks beside the pond to soak up the heat of the sun. If the sunlight vanished suddenly behind a cloud, as it did often, the cold air seemed to close about my skin like a sheet of metal. The moment I heard of the general's misfortune, standing there in the front entrance hall, I had that same feeling. It was as though the sun had vanished, possibly for good, and I was now condemned to stand wet and naked in the icy air. Within a week of the policeman's visit, our Okia had been stripped of the things other families had lost long ago, such as stores of food, undergarments, and so forth. We'd always been Mamaha's source for packets of tea. I think she'd been using them to purchase favors, but now her supplies were better than ours, and she became our source instead. Toward the end of the month, the neighborhood association began confiscating many of our ceramics and scrolls to sell them on what we called the gray market, which was different from the black market. The black market was for things like fuel, oil, foods, metals, and so on, mostly items that were rationed or illegal to trade. The gray market was more innocent. It was mainly housewives selling off their precious things to raise cash. In our case, though, our things were sold to punish us as much as for any other reason, and so the cash went to benefit others. The head of the neighborhood association, who was mistress of a nearby Okia, felt deeply sorry whenever she came to take her things away, but the military and police had given orders. No one could do anything but obey. If the early years of the war had been like an exciting voyage out to sea, you might say that by about the middle of 1943, we all realized the waves were simply too big for our craft. We thought we could drown, all of us, and many did. It wasn't just that day-to-day life that had grown increasingly miserable. No one dared admit it, but I think we'd all begun worrying about the outcome of the war. No one had fun any longer. Many people seemed to feel it was unpatriotic even to have a good time. The closest thing to a joke I heard during this period was something the geisha Raiha had uh, said one night. For months we'd heard rumors that the Japanese for months we'd heard rumors that the military government planned to shut down all the geisha districts in Japan. Lately we began to realize that it was really Lately we'd begun to realize that it really was going to happen. We were all wondering what would become of us, when suddenly Raiha spoke up. "We can't waste our time thinking about such things," she said. "Nothing is bleaker than the future, except perhaps the past." It may not sound funny to you, but that night we laughed until tears beaded the corners of our eyes. One day soon the geisha districts would indeed close. When they did, they were certain to end up working in the factories. To give you some idea of what life in the factories was like, let me tell you about Hatsumomo's friend Corinne. During the previous winter, the catastrophe that every geisha in Gion feared most, uh, yeah, during the previous winter, the catastrophe that every geisha in Gion feared most had actually happened to Corinne. A maid tending the bath in her okia had tried to burn a maid tending the bath in her okia had tried to burn newspapers to heat the water, but had lost control of the flames. The entire okia was destroyed, along with its collection of kimono. Corinne ended up working in a factory south of the city, fitting lenses into the equipment used for dropping bombs from airplanes. She came back to visit Gion from time to time as the months passed, but we were horrified at how much she'd changed. It wasn't just that she seemed more and more unhappy. We'd all experienced unhappiness and were prepared for it in any case. But she had a cough that was as much a part of her as a song is part of a bird, and her skin was stained as though she'd soaked it in ink. Since the coal the factories used was of a very low grade, and covered everything in soot as it burned. Poor Corinne was forced to work double shifts while being fed no more than a bowl of weak broth with a few noodles once a day, or watery rice gruel flavored with potato skin. So you can imagine how terrified we were of the factories. Every day when we wakened to find Gion still open, we felt grateful. Then, one morning in January of the following year, I was standing in line at the rice store in the falling snow, holding my ration coupons, when the shopkeeper next door put out his head and called into the cold air, into the cold. "It's happened!" We all of us looked at one another. I was too numbed with the cold to care about what he was talking about, for I wore only a heavy shawl around my peasant's clothes. No one wore kimono during the day any longer. Finally, the geisha in front of me brushed the snow from her eyebrows and asked him what he was talking about. "The war hasn't come to an end, has it?" she asked. "The government announced the closing of the geisha districts," he said. "All of you are to report to the registry office tomorrow morning." For a long moment we listened to the sound of a radio inside a shop. Then the door rumbled closed again, and there was nothing but the soft hiss of the falling snow. I looked at... Also, Chandler, update. Am I still, muffled? Damn, but it's not a lot, right? You can still hear me, right? Because because I don't want it to be unintelligible for you. Oh, okay. Cool. I just wanted to know that. Okay. So yeah. Yeah, for a long moment, we listened to the sound of of a radio inside a shop. Then the door rumbled close again, and there was nothing but the soft hiss of the falling snow. I looked at the despair on the faces of the other geisha around me, and knew in an instant that we were all thinking the same thing. Which of the men we knew would save us from life in the factories? Even though General Totori had been my danna until the previous year, I certainly wasn't the only geisha acquainted with him. I had to reach him before anyone else did. I wasn't properly dressed for the weather, but I put my ration coupons back into the pocket of my peasant's pants and set out at once for the northwest of the city. The general was rumored to be living in the Suruya Inn, the same one where we'd met during the evenings twice a week for so many years. I arrived there an hour or so later, burning with the cold and dusted all over with snow. But when I greeted the mistress, she took a long look at me before bowing in apology and saying she had no idea who I was. "It's me, mistress. Sayuri. I've come to speak with the general." "Sayuri-san, my heavens! I never thought to see you looking like the wife of a peasant." She led me inside at once, but wouldn't present me to the general until she'd first taken me upstairs and dressed me in one of her kimono. She even put on me a bit of makeup she'd stashed away, so the general would know me when he saw me. When I entered his room, General Totori was sitting at the table listening to a drama on the radio. His cotton robe hung open, exposing his bony chest and the thin gray hairs. I could see that his hardships of the past year had been far worse than mine. After all, he had been accused of awful crimes, negligence, incompetence, abuse of power, and so forth. Some people considered him lucky to have escaped prison. An article in a magazine had even blamed him for the Imperial Navy's defeats in the South Pacific, saying that he had failed to oversee the shipment of supplies. Still, some men bear hardship better than others, and with one look at the general, I could see that the weight of this past year had pressed down upon him until his bones had grown brittle, and even his face had come to look a bit misshapen. In the past, he smelled of sour pickles at the time. Now, as I bowed low on the mats near him, he had a different sort of sour smell. "You're looking very well, General," I said, though of course this was a lie. "What a pleasure it is to see you again." The general switched off the radio. "You're not the first to come to me," he said. "There's nothing I can do to help you, Sayuri. But I rushed here so quickly. I can't imagine how anyone reached you before I did. Since last week, nearly every geisha I know has been to see me, but I don't have friends in power any longer. I don't know why a geisha of your standing should come to see me anyway. You're liked by so many men with influence. To be liked and to have true friends willing to help are two very different things," I said. "Yes, so they are. What sort of help have you come to me for anyway?" "Any help at all, General. We talk about nothing these days in Gion but how miserable life in a factory will be. Life will be miserable for the lucky ones. The rest won't even live to see the end of the war." "I don't understand." "The bombs will fall soon," the general said. "You can be certain the factories won't take more than their share. But if you want, If you want to be alive when this war is over, you'd better find someone who can tuck you away in a safe place. I'm sorry I'm not that man. I've already exhausted what influence I had. The general asked after Mother's health. Yeah, the general asked after Mother's health and Auntie's, and soon bid me goodbye. I learned only much later that I learned only much later what he meant about exhausting his influence. The proprietress of the Suryo had a young daughter. The general had a the general had arranged to send her to a town in northern Japan. On the way back to the Okia, I knew the time had come for me to act, but I couldn't think what to do. Even the simple task even the simple task of holding my panic at arm's length seemed more than I could manage. I went by the apartment where Mama Ho was now living, for her relationship with the Baron had ended several months earlier, and she'd moved into a much smaller place, into a much smaller space. I thought she might know what course I should take, but in fact, she was in nearly as much panic. She, yeah, she, but in fact, she was in nearly as much of a panic as I was. The Baron will do nothing to help me, she said, her face pale with worry. I've been unable to reach the other men I have in mind. You had better think of someone, Sayuri, and go to him as quickly as you can. I'd been out of touch with Nobu for more than 4 years by that time. Jesus. Yeah, this book fucking skips. It fucking skips, man. Jesus. Yeah, I'd been out of touch with Nobu for more than 4 years by that time. I knew at once I couldn't approach him. As for the chairman, well, I would have grabbed any excuse just to speak with him, but I could never have asked him for a favor. However warmly he may have treated me in the hallways, I wasn't invited to his parties, even when lesser geisha were. I felt hurt by this, but what could I do? In any case, even if the chairman had wanted to help me, his quarrels with the military government had been in the newspapers lately. He had too many troubles of his own. So I spent the rest of that afternoon going from tea house to tea house in the biting cold, asking about a number of men I hadn't seen in weeks or even months. None of the mistresses knew where to find them. That evening, the Ichiriku was busy with farewell party. Sorry. Yeah, that evening, the Ichiriki was busy with farewell parties. It was fascinating to see how differently all the geisha reacted to the news. Some looked as though their spirits had been murdered within them. Others were like statues of the Buddha, calm and lovely, but painted over by with a layer of sadness. I can't say how I myself looked, but my mind was like an abacus. I was so busy with scheming and plotting, thinking which man I would approach and how I would do it, that I scarcely heard the maid who told me I was wanted in another room. I imagined a group of men had requested my company, but she led me up the stairs to the second floor and along a corridor to the very back of the tea house. She opened the door of a small tatami room I'd never entered before, and there at the table, alone with a glass of beer, sat Nobu. Before I could even bow to him or speak a word, he said, "Sayuri-san, you've disappointed me." "My goodness, I haven't had the honor of your company for 4 years, Nobu-san, and already in an instant I've disappointed you. What could I have done wrong so quickly?" I had a little bet with myself that your mouth would fall open at the sight of me. The truth is, I'm too startled to even move. Yeah, the truth is, I'm too startled even to move. Come inside and let the maid close the door. But first, tell her to bring another glass and another beer. There's something you and I must drink to. I did as Nobu told me, and then knelt at the end of the table with a corner between us. I could feel Nobu's eyes upon my face, almost as though he were touching me. I blushed as one might blush under the warmth of the sun, for I'd forgotten how flattering it felt to be admired. I see angles in your face I've never seen before, he said to me. Don't tell me you're going hungry like everyone else. I'd never expect such a thing of you. Nobu-san looks a bit thin himself. I have food enough to eat, just no time for eating it. I'm glad at least that you are keeping busy. That's the most peculiar thing I've ever heard. When you see a man who has kept himself alive by dodging bullets, do you feel glad for him that he has something to occupy his time? I hope Nobu-san doesn't mean to say that he is truly in fear for his life. There's no one out to murder me, if that's what you mean. But if Iwamura Electric is my life, then yes, I'm certainly in fear for it. Now tell me this. What has become of that Danna of yours? The General is doing as well as any of us, I suppose. How kind of you to ask. Oh, I don't mean it kindly at all. Very few people wish him well these days, but to change the subject, Nobu-san, am I to suppose that you have been coming here to the Ichiriki night after night, but keeping yourself hidden from me by using this peculiar upstairs room? It is a peculiar room, isn't it? I think it's the only one in the tea house without a garden view. It looks out onto the street. Yeah, it looks out on the street if you open those paper screens. Nobu-san knows the room well. Not really. It's the first time I've used it. I made a face at him when he said this, to show I didn't believe him. You may think what you want, Sayuri, but it's true. I've never been in this room before. I think it's a bedroom for overnight guests, when the mistress has any. She was kind enough to let me use it tonight, when I explained to her why I'd come. How mysterious. So you had a purpose in coming. Will I find out what it is? I hear the maid returning with her beer, Nobu said. You'll find out when she's gone. The door slid open, and the maid placed the beer on the table. Beer was a rare commodity during this period, so it was quite something to watch the gold liquid rising in the glass. When the maid had left, we raised our glasses, and Nobu said, I have come here to toast your Danna. I put down my beer when I heard this. I must say, Nobu-san, there are few things any of us can find to be cheerful about. But it would take me weeks even to begin imagining why you would wish to drink in honor of my Danna. I should have been more specific. Here's to the foolishness of your Danna. 4 years ago, I told you he was an unworthy man, and he has proved me right. Wouldn't you say? The truth is, he isn't my Danna any longer. Just my point. And even if he were, he couldn't do a thing for you, could he? I know Guion is going to close, and everyone's in a panic about it. I received a telephone call at my office today from a certain Geisha. I won't name her, but can you imagine? She asked if I could find her a job at Uemura Electric. If you don't mind my asking, what did you tell her? I don't have a job for anyone, hardly even myself. Even the chairman may be out of a job soon and end up in prison if he doesn't start doing as the government orders. He's persuaded them we don't have the means to manufacture bayonets and bullet castings. But now they want us to design and build fighter airplanes. I mean, honestly, fighter airplanes? We manufacture appliances. Sometimes I wonder what these people are thinking. Nobu-san should speak more quietly. Who's going to hear me? That general of yours? Speaking of the general, I said, I did go to see him today to ask for his help. You're lucky he was still alive to see you. Yeah, you're lucky he was still alive to see you. Has he been ill? Not ill, but he'll get around to killing himself one of these days, if he has the courage. Please, Nobu-san. He didn't help you, did he? No. He said he'd already used up whatever influence he had. That wouldn't have taken him long. Why didn't he save what little influence he had for you? I haven't seen him in more than a year. You haven't seen me in more than 4 years, and I have saved my best influence for you. Why didn't you come to me before now? But I've imagined you angry with me all this time. Just look at you, Nobu-san. How could I have come to you? How could you not? I can save you from the factories. I have access to the perfect haven, and believe me, it is perfect, just like the nest for a bird. You're the only one I'll give it to, Sayuri, and I won't give it even to you until you bowed on the floor right here in front of me and admitted how wrong you were for what happened 4 years ago. You're certainly right I'm angry with you. We both may be dead before we see each other again. I may have lost the one chance I had, and it isn't enough that you brushed me aside. You wasted the very ripest years of your life on a fool, a man who won't pay even the debt he owes to his country, much less to you. He goes on living as if he's done nothing wrong. You can imagine how I was feeling at this time, for Nobu was a man who could hurl his words like stone. It wasn't just the words themselves or their meaning, but the way he said them. At first, I'd been determined not to cry, regardless of what he said. But soon it occurred to me that crying might be the very thing Nobu wanted of me. And it felt so easy, like letting a piece of paper slip from my fingers. Every tear that slid down my cheeks, I cried for a different reason. There seemed so much to mourn. I cried for Nobu and for myself. I cried at wondering what would become of us all. I even cried for General Totori and for Corinne, who had grown so gray and hollow from life in the factory. And then I did what Nobu demanded of me. I moved away from the table to make room, and I bowed low to the floor. Forgive me for my foolishness, I said. Oh, get up off the mats. I'm satisfied if you tell me you won't make the same mistake again. I will not. Every moment you spent with that man was wasted. That's just what I told you That's just what I told you would happen. Yeah, that's just what I told you would happen, isn't it? Perhaps you've learned enough by now to follow your destiny in the future. I will follow my destiny, Nobu-san. There's nothing more I want from life. I'm pleased to hear that. And where does your destiny lead you? To the man who runs Iwamura Electric, I said. Of course, I was thinking of the chairman. So it does, Nobu said. Now, let us drink our beers together. I wet my lips, for I was far too confused and upset to be thirsty. After Nobu told me about the nest he'd set aside, it was the home of his good friend Adashino Isamu, the kimono maker. I don't know if you remember him, but he was the guest of honor at the party on the Baron's estate years earlier, at which Nobu and Dr. Crab were present. Mr. Adashino's home, which was also his workshop, was on the banks of the Kamo River shallows, about 5 kilometers upstream from Gion. Until a few years earlier, he and his wife and daughter had made kimono in the lovely Yuzen style for which he was famous. Lately, however, all the kimono makers had been put to work sewing parachutes, for they were accustomed to working with silk, after all. It was a job I could learn quickly, said Nobu, and the Adashino family was very willing to have me. Nobu himself would make the necessary arrangements with the authorities. He wrote the address of Mr. Adashino's home on a piece of paper and gave it to me. I told Nobu a number of times how grateful I was. Each time I told him, he looked more pleased with himself. Just as I was about to suggest that we take a walk together in the newly fallen snow, he glanced at his watch and drained the last sip of his beer. Sayuri, he said to me. I don't know when we will see each other again, or what the world will be like when we do. We may both have seen many horrible things, but I will think of you every time I need to be reminded that there is beauty and goodness in the world. Nobu-san, perhaps you ought to have been a poet. You know perfectly well there's nothing poetic about me. Do your enchanting words mean you're about to leave? I was hoping we might take a stroll together. It's much too cold, but you may see me to the door, and we'll say goodbye there. I followed Nobu down the stairs and crouched in the entry of the tea house to help him into his shoes. Afterward, I slipped my feet into the tall wooden geta I was wearing because of the snow, and walked Nobu out to the street. Years earlier, our car would have been waiting for him, but only government officials had cars these days, for almost no one could find the gasoline to run them. I suggested walking him to the trolley. I don't want your company just now, Nobu said. I'm on my way to a meeting with our Kyoto distributor. I have too many things on my mind as it is. I must say, Nobu-san, I much preferred your parting words in the upstairs room. In that case, stay there next time. I bowed and told Nobu goodbye. Most men would have probably turned to look over their shoulders at some point, but Nobu just plodded through the snow as far as the corner, and then turned up Shijo Avenue and was gone. In my hand, I held the piece of paper he'd given me, with Mr. Adashino's address written on it. I realized I was squeezing it so hard in my fingers that if it were possible to crush it, I'm sure I would have. I couldn't think why I felt so nervous and afraid, but after gazing a moment at the snow still falling around me, I looked at Nobu's deep footprint leading to the corner. yeah, leading to the corner, and had the feeling I knew just what was troubling me. When would I ever see Nobu again? Or the chairman? Or, for that matter, Gion itself? Once before, as a child, I'd been torn from my home. I suppose it was the memory of those horrible years that made me feel so alone. And that is the end of that chapter. We will go on to the next chapter. I think I'll only read, I'll only read 2 chapters tonight because I want to play Phasmophobia, and then also if I can figure out why OBS isn't showing the time spent, like the duration right here. I think it's weird. I want to fix that if I can. Okay, but yeah, on to chapter 29. 29. Okay, chapter 29. Does this... Okay. Yeah, chapter 29. You may think that because I was a successful young geisha with great many admirers, someone else might have stepped forward to rescue me, even if Nobu hadn't. But a geisha in need is hardly like a jewel dropped on the street, which anyone might be happy to pick up. Every one of the hundreds of geisha in Gion was struggling to find a nest from the war in those final weeks, and only a few were lucky enough to find one. So you see, every day I lived with the Arashino family, I felt myself more and more in Nobu's debt. I discovered how fortunate I really was during the spring of the following year, when I learned that the geisha Raiha had been killed in the firebombing of Tokyo. It was Raiha who'd made us laugh by saying that nothing was as bleak as the future, except the past. She and her mother had been prominent geisha, and her father was a member of a famous merchant family. To those of us in Gion, no one had seemed more likely to survive the war than Raiha. At the time of her death, she was apparently reading a book to one of her young nephews on her father's estate in the Denen Chafu section of Tokyo. And I'm sure she probably felt safe. And I'm sure she probably felt as safe there as she had in Kyoto. Strangely, the same air raid that killed Raiha also killed the great sumo wrestler, Miyagiyama. Both have been living in relative comfort. And yet Pumpkin, who had seemed so lost to me, managed to survive the war. Though the lens factory where she was working on the outskirts of Osaka was bombed 5 or 6 times. I learned that year that nothing is so unpredictable as who will survive a war and who won't. Mamako survived, working in a small hospital in Fukui prefecture as a nurse's assistant. But her maid, Tatsumi, was killed by the terrible bomb that fell on Nagasaki, and her dresser, Mr. Ichida, died of a heart attack during an air raid drill. Mr. Beku, on the other hand, worked on a naval base in Osaka and yet survived somehow. So did General Totori, who lived in the Surya Inn until his death in the mid-1950s. And the Baron too, though I'm sorry to say that in the early years of the Allied occupation, The Baron drowned himself in his splendid pond after his title, and many of his holdings were taken away. I don't think he could face a world in which he was no longer free to act on his every whim. As for Mother, there was never a moment's doubt in my mind she would survive. With her highly developed ability to benefit from others' suffering, she fell so naturally into work in the gray market that it was as if she'd done it all along. She spent the war growing richer instead of poor, buying and selling other people's heirlooms. Whenever Mr. Arashino sold a kimono from his collection in order to raise cash, he asked me to contact Mother so she could recover it for him. Many of the kimonos sold in Kyoto passed through her hands, you see. Mr. Arashino probably hoped Mother would forgo her profit and hold his kimono a few years until he could buy them back again. But she never seemed able to find them, or at least that was what she said. The Arashinos treated me with great kindness during the years I lived in their home. In the daytime, I worked with them sewing parachutes. At night, I slept along their daughter and grandson on futons spread out on the floor of the workshop. We had so little charcoal, we burned compressed leaves for warmth, or newspapers and magazines, anything we could find. Of course, food had grown still more scarce. You can't imagine some of the things we learned to eat, such as soybean dregs, usually given to livestock, and a hideous thing called nukapan. Nukapan, made by frying rice bran with wheat flour. It looked like old, dried leather, though I'm sure it probably would have tasted better. Very occasionally, we had small quantities of potatoes, or sweet potatoes, dried whale meat, sausage made from seals, and sometimes sardines, which we Japanese had never regarded as anything more than fertilizer. I grew so thin during these years that no one would have recognized me on the streets of Gion. Some days, the Arashino's little grandson, Juntaro, cried for hunger, which is when Mr. Arashino usually decided to sell a kimono from his collection. This is what we Japanese called the onion life, peeling away a layer at a time and crying all the while. One night in the spring of 1944, after I'd been living with the Arashino family no more than 3 or 4 months, we witnessed our first air raid. The stars were so clear, we could see the silhouettes of the bombers as they droned overhead, and also the shooting stars, as they seemed to us, that flew up from the earth and exploded near them. We were afraid we would hear the horrible whistling noise and watch Kyoto burn in flames all around us, and if it had, our lives would have ended right then, whether we had died or not, because Kyoto is as delicate as a moth's wing. If it had been crushed, it could never have recovered, as Osaka and Kyoto, and so many other cities were able to do. But the bombers passed over us, not only that night, but every night. Many evenings we watched the moon turn red from the fires in Osaka, and sometimes we saw ashes floating through the air like falling leaves. Even there in Kyoto, 50 kilometers away. You can well imagine that I worried desperately about the chairman and Nobu, whose company was based in Osaka, and who both had homes there, as well as in Kyoto. I wondered too what would become of my sister Satsu, wherever she was. I don't think I'd ever been consciously aware of it, but since the very week she'd run away, I had carried a belief shrouded somewhere in the back of my mind that the courses of our lives would one day bring us together again. I thought perhaps she might send a letter to me in care of the Nita Okia, or else come back to Kyoto looking for me. Then one afternoon, while I was taking little Juntaro for a walk along the river, picking out stones from the edge of the water and throwing them back in, It occurred to me that Setsu would never come back to Kyoto to find me. Now that I was living an impoverished life myself, I could see that traveling to some far-off city for any reason at all was out of the question. And in any case, Satsu and I probably wouldn't recognize each other on the street even if she did come. As for my fantasy that she might write me a letter, well, I felt like a foolish girl again. Had it really, had it really, had it really taken me all these years to understand that Satsu had no way of knowing the name of Benita Okia? She couldn't write me if she wanted. She couldn't write me if she wanted to, unless she unless she, unless she contacted Mr. Tanaka, and she would never do such a thing. While little Juntaro went on throwing stones in the river, I squatted beside him and trickled water onto my face with one hand, smiling at him all the while and pretending I'd done it to cool myself. My little ruse must have worked, because Juntaro seemed to have no idea that anything was the matter. Adversity is like a strong wind. I don't mean just that it holds us back from places we might otherwise go. It also tears away from it also tears us oh no adversity is like a strong wind. I don't mean just that it holds us back from places we might otherwise go. It also tears away from us all the things that cannot be torn, so that afterward we see ourselves as we really are, and not merely as we like to be. Mr. Adeshino's daughter, for example, suffered the death of her husband during the war, and afterward poured herself into two things: caring for her little boy and sewing parachutes for the soldiers. She seemed to live for nothing else. When she grew thinner and thinner, you knew where every gram of her was going. By the war's end, she clutched at that child as though he were the cliff's edge that kept her from falling into the rocks below. Because I'd lived through adversity once before, what I learned about myself was like a reminder of something I'd once known, but had nearly forgotten. Namely, that beneath the elegant clothing and the accomplished dancing and the clever conversation, my life had no complexity at all, but it was as simple as a stone falling toward the ground. My whole purpose in everything during the past 10 years had been to win the affections of the chairman. Day after day, I watched the swift water of the Kamo River shallows rushing below the workshop. Sometimes I threw a pebble into it, or a piece of straw, knowing that it would be carried all the way to Osaka before washing out into the sea. I wondered if perhaps the chairman, sitting at his desk, might look out at his window one afternoon and see that pebble or that straw, and perhaps think of me. But soon I began to have a troubling thought. The chairman might see it, perhaps, though I doubted he would. But even if he did, and he leaned back in his chair to think of the hundreds of things the pedal might bring to mind, I might not be one of them. He had often been kind to me, it was true, but he was a kind man. He'd never shown the least sign of recognizing that I had once been the girl he'd comforted, or that I cared for him or thought of him. One day I came to a realization, more painful in some ways even than my sudden understanding that Satsu and I were unlikely to be reunited. I'd spent the previous night nursing a troubling thought, wondering for the first time what might happen if I'd reached the end of my life and still and still the chairman had never taken any special notice of me. That next morning, I looked carefully at my almanac in the hopes of finding some sign that my life wouldn't be lived without purpose. I was feeling so dejected that even Mr. Adeshina seemed to recognize it and sent me on an errand to purchase sewing needles at the dry goods store, 30 minutes away. Yeah, on my way, on my walk back, strolling along the roadside as the sun was setting, I was nearly run down by an army truck. It's the closest I've ever come to being killed. Only the next morning did I notice that my almanac had warned against travel in the direction of the rat, precisely the direction in which the dry goods store lay. I'd been looking only for a sign about the chairman, and hadn't noticed. From this experience, I understood the danger of focusing only on what isn't there. What if I came to the end of my life and realized that I'd spent every day watching for a man who would never come to me? What an unbearable sorrow it would be to realize I'd never really tasted things I'd eaten or seen the places I'd been because I'd thought nothing but the chairman, even while my life was drifting away from me. And yet, if I drew my thoughts back from him, what life would I have? I would be like a dancer who had practiced since childhood for a performance she would never give. The war ended for us in August of 1945. Most anyone who lived in Japan during this time will tell you that it was the very bleakest moment in a long night of darkness. Our country wasn't simply defeated, it was destroyed. And I don't mean by all the bombs, as horrible as those were. When your country has lost a war and an invading army pours in, you feel as though you yourself had been led to the execution ground to kneel, hands bound, and wait for the sword to fall. During a period of a year or more, I never once heard the sound of laughter, unless it was little Juntaro, who didn't know any better. When Juntaro left, his grandfather waved a hand to shush him. I've often observed that man and woman who were young children during these years to have a certain seriousness about them. There was too little laughter in their childhoods. By the spring of 1946, we'd all come to recognize that we would live through the ordeal of defeat. There were even those who believed Japan would one day be renewed. All the stories about invading American soldiers, raping and killing us had turned out to be wrong. And in fact, we gradually came to realize that the Americans on the whole were remarkably kind. One day, an entourage of them came riding through the area in their trucks. I stood watching them with the other woman from the neighborhood. I'd learned during my years in Gion to regard myself as the inhabitant of a special world that separated me from other women. In fact, I'd felt so separated all these years that I'd only rarely wondered how other women lived, even the wives of the men I'd entertained. Yet there I stood in a pair of torn work pants, and with my stringy hair hanging along my back. I hadn't bathed in several days, for we had no fuel to heat the water more than a few minutes each week. To the eyes of the American soldiers who drove past, I looked no different from the women around me, and as I thought of it, who could say I was any different? If you no longer have leaves or bark or roots, can you go on calling yourself a tree? I am a peasant, I said to myself, and not a geisha at all any longer. It was a frightening feeling to look at my hands and see their roughness, to draw my mind away from my fears. I turned my attention again to the truckloads of soldiers driving past. Weren't these the very American soldiers we'd been taught to hate, who had bombed our cities with such horrifying weapons? Now they rode through our neighborhood, throwing pieces of candy to the children. Within a year after the surrender, within a year after the surrender, Mr. Adeshino had been encouraged to begin making kimono once again. I knew nothing about kimono except how to wear them, so I was given the task of spending my days in the basement of the workshop annex, tending to the vats of dye as they boiled. This was a horrid, this was a horrid job, partly because we couldn't afford any fuel but tandan, which is a kind of coal dust held together by tar. You cannot imagine the stench when it burns. Over time, Mr. Adeshino's wife taught me how to gather the proper leaves, stems, and bark to make the dyes myself, which may sound like something of a premonition. Not a premonition. Which may sound like something of a promotion. And it might have been, except that one of the materials, I never found out which, had the strange effect of pickling my skin. My delicate dancer's hands, which I'd once nurtured with the finest creams, now began to peel like the papery outside of an onion, and were stained all over the color of a bruise. During this time, impelled probably by my own loneliness, I became involved in a brief romance with a young tatami maker named Inoue. I thought he looked quite handsome. I thought he looked quite handsome, with his soft eyebrows like smudges on his delicate skin, and a perfect smoothness to his lips. Every few nights during the course of several weeks, I sneaked into the annex to let him in. I didn't realize quite how gruesome my hands looked until one night, when the fire under the vats was burning so brightly we could see each other. After Inoue caught a glimpse of my hands, he wouldn't even let me touch him with them. Yeah, after Inoue caught a glimpse of my hands, he wouldn't let me touch him with them. To allow my skin some relief, Mr. Adeshino gave me the task of gathering spider warts during the summertime. The spider wort is a flower whose juice is used for painting the silks before they are masked with starch and then dried. They tend to grow around the edges of ponds and lakes during the rainy season. I thought gathering them sounded like a pleasant job. So one morning in July, I set out with my rucksack, ready to enjoy the cool, dry day. But soon I discovered that spiderworts were devilishly clever flowers. As far as I could tell, they'd enlisted every insect in Western Japan as an ally. Whenever I tore off a handful of flowers, I was attacked by divisions of ticks and mosquitoes, and to make matters worse, one time I stepped on a hideous little frog. Then, after I'd spent a miserable week gathering the flowers, I took on what I thought to be a much easier task, just squeezing them spiderwort. Ooh, those are pretty. I think I've seen them before, but maybe I've seen a different type of flower that looks similar to them. just also update Chandler. Am I still muffled? Sorry. I just want to see if I'm still muffled. Damn. I wonder what's wrong. Hopefully it's not doing that for OBS too. That'd be a shame. Okay. Alrighty. Whenever I tore off a handful of flowers, I was attacked by divisions of ticks and mosquitoes. And to make matters worse, one time I stepped on a hideous little frog. Then, after I'd spent a miserable week gathering the flowers, I took on what I thought to be a much easier task. I squeezed them in a press to extract their juices. But if you've never smelled the juice of a spiderwort, well, I was very glad at the end of the week to go back to boiling dyes once again. I worked very hard during those years, but every night when I went to bed, I thought of Guion. All the geisha districts in Japan had reopened within a few months of the surrender, but I wasn't free to go back until Mother summoned me. She was making quite a good living selling kimono artwork and Japanese swords to American soldiers. So for the time being, she and Auntie remained on the little farm west. So for the time being, she and Auntie remained on the little farm west of Kyoto, where they had set up shop, while I continued to live and work with the Adashino family. Considering that Gion was a few kilometers away, you may think I visited there often, and yet in nearly 5 years I lived away, I went only once. It was one afternoon during spring, about a year after the end of the war, while I was on my way back from picking up medicine for little Juntaro at the Kamigyo Prefecture Hospital. I took a walk along Kawaramachi Avenue as far as Shijo and crossed the bridge from there into Gion. I was shocked to see whole families crowded together in poverty along the river's edge. In Gion, I recognized a number of geisha, though of course they didn't recognize me, and I didn't speak a word to them, hoping for once to view the place as an outsider might. In truth, though, I could scarcely see Gion at all as I strolled through it. I saw instead only my ghostly memories. When I walked along the banks of the Shirakawa stream, I thought of the many afternoons Mamaha and I spent walking there. Nearby was the bench where Pumpkin and I had sat with 2 bowls of noodles on the night I asked for her help. Not far away was the alley where Nobu had chastened me for taking the general as my danna. From there, I walked half a block to the corner of Shijo Avenue, where I'd made the young delivery man drop the lunch boxes he was carrying. In all these spots, I felt I was standing on a stage many hours after the dance had ended. When the silence lay as heavily upon the empty theater as a blanket of snow. I went to Harokiya and stared with longing. At the heavy iron padlock on the door. When I was locked in, I wanted to be out. Now life had changed so much that, finding myself locked out, I wanted to be inside again. And yet, I was a grown woman, free, if I wished, to stroll out of Gion at that very moment and never come back. One bitter cold afternoon in November, 3 years after the end of the war, I was warming my hands over the dye vats in the annex when Mrs. Adashino came down to say that someone wished to see me. I could tell from her expression that the visitor wasn't just another of the women from the neighborhood. But you can imagine my surprise when I reached the top of the stairs and saw Nobu. He was sitting in the workshop with Mr. Arashino, holding an empty teacup, as though he'd been there chatting for some time already. Mr. Arashino stood when he saw me. I have some work to I have some work in the next room, Nobu-san, he said. You two can stay here and talk. I'm delighted you've come to see us. Yeah. I have some work in the next room, Nobu-san, he said. You two can stay here and talk. I'm delighted you've come to see us. Don't fool yourself, Arashino, Nobu replied. Sayuri is the person I've come to see. I thought this an unkind thing for Nobu to have said, and not at all funny. But Mr. Arashino laughed when he heard it, and rolled the door to the workshop closed behind him. I thought the whole world had changed, I said. But it can't be so, for Nobu-san has stayed exactly the same. I never change, he said. But I haven't come here to chat. I want to know what's the matter with you. Nothing is the matter. Hasn't Nobu-san been receiving my letters? Your letters all read like poems. You never talk about anything but the beautiful trickling water or some such nonsense. Why, Nobu-san, I'll never waste another letter on you. I'd rather you didn't, if that's how they sound. Why can't you just tell me the things I want to know, such as when you're coming back to Gion? Every month I telephone the Ichiriki to ask about you, and the mistress gives me some excuse or other. I thought I might find you ill with some horrible disease. You're skinnier than you were, I suppose. But you look healthy enough to me. What's keeping you? I certainly think of Gion every day. Your friend Mamaha came back a year or more ago. Even Michizona, as old as she is, showed up the day it reopened. But no one has been able to tell me why Sayuri won't come back. To tell the truth, the decision isn't mine. I've been waiting for Mother to reopen the Okiya. I'm as eager to get back to Gion as Nobu-san is to have me there. Then call that mother of yours and tell her the time has come. I've been patient the past 6 months. Didn't you understand what I was telling you in my letters? When you said you wanted me back in Gion, I thought you meant that you hoped to see me there soon. If I say I want to see you back in Gion, what I mean is I want you to pack your bags and go back to Gion. I don't see why you need to wait for that mother of yours anyway. If she hasn't had the sense to go back now, she's a fool. Few people have anything good to say about her, but I can assure you she's no fool. Nobu-san might even admire her if he came to know her. She's making a fine living selling souvenirs to American soldiers. The soldiers won't be here forever. You tell her your good friend Nobu wants you back in Gion. At this, he took a little package with his one hand and tossed it onto the mats next to me. He didn't say a word afterward, but only sipped at his tea and looked at me. What is Nobu-san throwing at me? He said. It's a gift I've brought. Open it. If Nobu-san is giving me a gift, first I must bring my gift for him. I went to the corner of the room, where I kept my trunk of belongings, and found a folding fan I'd long ago decided to give to Nobu. A fan may seem a simple gift from a man who saved me from life in the factories, but to a geisha, the fans we use and dance are like sacred objects, and this wasn't just an ordinary dancer's fan, but the very one my teacher had given me when I reached the level of shisho in the Inoue School of Dance. I never before, I never before heard a geisha parting with such a thing, which was the very reason I decided to give it to him. I wrapped the fan in a square of cotton and went back to present him to it, and went back to him, and went back to present it to him. He was puzzled when he opened it, as I knew he would be. I did my best to explain why I wanted him to have it. "It's kind of you," he said, but I'm unworthy of this gift. Offer it to someone who appreciates dance more than I do." "There's no one else I would give it to. It's a part of me, and I have given it to Nobu-san." "In that case, I'm very grateful, and I'll cherish it. Now open the package I've brought you." Wrapped inside paper and string and padded with layers of newspaper was a rock about the size of a fist. I'm sure I was at least as puzzled to receive a rock as Nobu must have been by the fan I'd given him. When I looked at it more closely, I saw it wasn't a rock at all, but a piece of concrete. You have in your hands, you have in your hand some rubble from our factory in Osaka," Nobu told me. Two of our 4 factories were destroyed. There's a danger our whole company may not survive the next few years. So you see, if you've given me a piece of yourself with that fan, I suppose I've just given you a piece of myself as well. If it's a piece of Nobu-san, then I will cherish it. I didn't give it to you to cherish. It's a piece of concrete. I want you to help me turn it into a lovely jewel for you to keep. I want you to help me turn it into a lovely jewel for you to keep. If Nobu-san knows how to do such a thing, please tell me, and we'll all be rich. I have a task for you to do in Guillaume. If it works out as I hope, our company will be back on its feet in a year or so. When I ask you for that piece of concrete back and replace it with a jewel instead, the time will have come for... When I ask you for that piece of concrete back and replace it with a jewel instead, the time will have come at last for me to become your Danna. My skin felt as cold as glass when I heard this, but I showed no sign of it. How mysterious, Nobu-san! A task I could undertake, which would be helpful to Iwamura Electric? It's an awful task. I won't lie to you. During the final 2 years before Guillaume closed, there was a man named Sato who used to go to parties as a guest of the prefecture governor. I want you to come back so you can entertain him. I had to laugh when I heard this. How horrible a task can that be? However much Nobu dislikes him, I'm sure I've entertained worse. If you remember him, you'll know exactly how horrible it is. He's irritating and he acts like a pig. He tells me he's always sat across the table so he could stare at you. You're the only thing he ever talks about. When he talks, that is. Because mostly he just sits. Maybe you saw him mentioned in the news magazines last month. He was just appointed to be Deputy Minister of Finance. My goodness! I said. He must be very capable. Oh, there are 15 or more men who hold that title. I know he's capable of pouring sake into his mouth. That's the only thing I've ever seen him do. It's a tragedy that the future of a great company like ours should be affected by a man like him. It's a terrible time to be alive, Sayuri. Nobu-san, you mustn't say a thing like that. Why on earth not? No one's going to hear me. It isn't a matter of who hears you, it's your attitude. You shouldn't think that way. Why shouldn't I? The company has never been in worse condition. All through the war, the chairman resisted what the government told him to do. By the time he finally agreed to cooperate, the war was almost over, and nothing we ever made for them, not one thing was taken into battle. But has that stopped the Americans from classifying Iromura Electric as a Zaibatsu, just like Mitsubishi? It's ridiculous. Compared to Mitsubishi, we're like a sparrow watching a lion. And there's something worse. If we can't convince them of our case, Iromura Electric will be seized, and its assets sold to pay war reparations. 2 weeks ago, I'd said that. Yeah, 2 weeks ago, I'd have said that was bad enough. But now they've appointed this fellow Sato to make a recommendation about our case. Those Americans think they were clever to appoint a Japanese. Well, I'd rather have seen a dog take the job than this man. Suddenly, Nobu interrupted himself. What on earth is the matter with your hands? Since coming up from the annex, I'd kept my hands hidden as best I could. Obviously, Nobu had caught sight of them somehow. Mr. Arashino was kind enough to give me the job of making dyes. Let's hope he knows how to remove those stains, said Nobu. You can't go back to Yon looking like that. Nobu-san, my hands are the least of my problems. I'm not sure I can go back to Yon now. I'll do my best to persuade Mother, but truthfully, it isn't my decision. Anyway, I'm sure there are other geishas who will be helpful. There aren't other geisha. Listen to me. I took Deputy Minister Sato to a tea house the other day with half a dozen people. He didn't speak a word for an hour, and then finally he cleared his throat and said, "This isn't the Ichiriki?" So I told him, "No, it's not. You certainly got that right." He grunted like a pig and then said, "Sayuri entertains at the Ichiriki." So I told him, "No, Minister, if she were in Gion at all, she would come right here and entertain us." But I told you, she isn't in Gion. And then he took his sake cup. I wish you were more polite with him than that, I said. I certainly wasn't. I can tolerate his company for about half an hour. After that, I'm not responsible for the things I say. That's exactly the reason I want you there. And don't tell me again it isn't your due. And don't tell me again it isn't your decision. You owe me this, and you know it perfectly well. Anyway, the truth is, I'd like the chance to spend some time with you myself. And I would like to spend time with Nobu-san. Just don't bring any illusions with you when you come. After the past few years, I'm sure I don't have any left. But is Nobu-san thinking of something in particular? Don't expect me to become your Dana in a month. That's what I'm saying. Until Iromura Electric has recovered, I'm in no position to make such an offer. I've been very worried about the company's prospects. But to tell the truth, Sayuri, I feel better about the future after seeing you again. Nobu-san, how kind. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not trying to flatter you. Your destiny and mine are intertwined, but I'll never be your Dana if Iwamura Electric doesn't recover. Perhaps the recovery, just like my meeting you in the first place, is simply meant to be. Yeah, perhaps the recovery, just like my meeting you in the first place, is simply meant to be. During the final years of the war, I had learned to stop wondering what this meant. Yeah, during the final years of the war, I had learned to stop wondering what was meant to be and what wasn't. I had often said to the women in the neighborhood that I wasn't sure if I'd ever go back to Guillaume. But the truth is, I had always known I would. My destiny, whatever it was, awaited me there. In these years away, I'd learned to suspend all the water in my personality by turning it to ice, you might say. Only by stopping the natural flow of my thoughts in this way could I bear the waiting. Now to hear Nobu refer to my destiny as, well, I felt he'd shattered the ice inside me and awakened my desires once again. Nobu-san, I said, if it's important to make a good impression on Deputy Minister Sato, perhaps you should ask the chairman to be there when you entertain him. The chairman is a busy man. But surely if the minister is important to the future of the company, you worry about getting yourself there. I'll worry about what's best for the company. I'll be very disappointed if you're not back in Guillaume by the end of the month. Nobu rose to leave, for he had to be back in Osaka before nightfall. I walked him to the entryway to help him with his coat and shoes, and put his fedora on his head for him. When I was done, he stood looking at me a long while. I thought he was about to say he found me beautiful, for this was the sort of comment he sometimes made after gazing at me for no reason. My goodness, Sayuri, you do look like a peasant, he said. He had a scowl on his face as he turned away. And that is the end of that lovely chapter. How lovely, right? Just lovely that he's just still so nice, man. So nice to the woman he cares for. Alright, well, thank you so much for listening. I will see you in the next video.